80,000 warriors, the most powerful military machine in the Americas, marching south with absolute confidence. They had crushed kingdoms, absorbed nations, and stretched their dominion across more than 4,000 kilometers of mountains, deserts, and valleys. Their roads rivaled those of ancient Rome. Their armies moved in disciplined decimal formations, units of 10, 100, 1,000, supplied by an unmatched network of storehouses. They believed they were unstoppable, and yet, at a cold river flowing from the Andean peaks, they would meet a people with no emperor, no golden temples, no stone capitals, and everything would change. By the mid-15th century, the empire, forged by Pachacuti, had transformed from a minor Andean kingdom into a continental power. From its capital at Cusco, the Inca state Tawantinsuyu, the realm of four quarters, expanded with calculated precision. Diplomacy always came first. Emissaries bearing gifts, promises of protection, offers of integration, and local rulers kept their positions while roads, irrigation systems, and administrative order followed. Refuse, and the second phase arrived with bronze weapons, slingers, and disciplined ranks trained from childhood. Under Tupac Inca Yupanqui, the empire's southern expansion intensified. Tens of thousands of soldiers marched beyond the deserts of northern Chile, incorporating one valley after another. Fortresses rose, tambos stocked supplies. The imperial road crept steadily toward the unknown, then the advance halted at the Maule River. On the southern banks lived the Mapuche. They were not a centralized kingdom. They had no single capital to besiege, no emperor to capture, no treasury to seize. Their society was decentralized, organized into clans led by local longos, and in times of crisis they united under a war leader, a toki. Every man grew up with weapons in hand. Every valley was familiar ground. When Inca envoys offered peaceful submission and inclusion into Tawantinsuyu, the response was blunt: return north. These lands would never pay tribute. The first crossing of the Maule was conducted with textbook precision. Inca units waited in formation. Officers barked commands. But as half the army reached the southern bank, thousands of Mapuche warriors descended from the hills in a coordinated assault. They did not seek orderly engagement. They sought rupture. Their aim was not to match discipline with discipline, but to shatter it. Once Inca formations broke, numerical advantage dissolved into chaos. Combat turned into close-range brutality. Macanas of hardwood crushed helmets. Spears pierced quilted armor. The river reportedly ran red for hours. Tupac Inca Yupanqui faced a decision few Inca commanders had ever confronted: reinforce and risk annihilation, or retreat and preserve what remained. He chose withdrawal. The empire that had seemed limitless met its first immovable boundary, yet the Inca did not abandon the south immediately. A second campaign attempted fortified occupation pucaras built at intervals. Colonies of loyal settlers relocated from the imperial heartland. The strategy mirrored frontier systems elsewhere in the world. Whole ground with stone and permanence. The Mapuche answered not with frontal assaults, but isolation. Supply lines were severed, patrols ambushed, fields destroyed. Each fortress became an island in hostile territory. Slowly, inexorably, the garrisons withered. The empire could win battles, but it could not sustain presence. Under Huayna Capac, a final push tried gradual consolidation rather than decisive confrontation. Even this faltered. Eventually, an uneasy boundary solidified near the Maule. The Inca court would later frame the outcome as strategic choice, not defeat. But veterans understood there existed a people who had stopped the empire. Then history shifted violently. In 1532, Francisco Pizarro arrived in Peru amid civil war between the Atahualpa and Huáscar. With fewer than 200 Spaniards, horses, steel, firearms, and ruthless opportunism, he captured the emperor at Cajamarca. The Inca state, centralized and hierarchical, collapsed with shocking speed once its apex was severed. Spanish conquest spread southward. In 1540, Pedro de Valdivia marched from Peru to found Santiago. Early resistance in central Chile was overcome. Confident after defeating a vast empire, the Spaniards assumed that decentralized tribes would pose little threat. They misread the land, and its people died. In 1553, a young Mapuche leader named Lautaro emerged. Once captured and forced to serve the Spaniards, he had learned their methods: how cavalry maneuvered, how firearms reloaded, how armor protected yet constrained. He reorganized Mapuche forces with unprecedented coordination. At the Battle of Tucapel, Spanish cavalry was lured into terrain unsuitable for maneuver. Waves of warriors targeted horses first, dragging armored riders to the ground. Valdivia himself was captured and killed. It was one of the most severe Spanish defeats in the Americas. The war that followed later, known as the Arauco War, would not last years, but centuries. Leaders such as Capulcan and Galvarino continued resistance despite brutal reprisals. By the late 16th century, Spain formalized a military frontier at the Biobío River, acknowledging in practice what the Inca had learned before them. Conquest had limits, even after Chilean independence in the 19th century. The frontier question persisted. The campaign, known as the Pacification of Araucania, between 1861 and 1883 finally imposed state control through modern rifles, artillery, and telegraph coordination. Mapuche lands were seized, communities confined to reductions, autonomy dismantled. For centuries, however, the Mapuche had achieved something extraordinary. They halted an Andean empire at its height. They fought the Spanish crown to a negotiated boundary. They maintained sovereignty longer than any other indigenous nation in southern South America. Their story is not merely one of resistance, but of adaptation, endurance, and the hard truth that even the greatest empires eventually meet a line they cannot cross. The uneasy balance at the Maule did not mean peace, it meant recognition. The Inca court in Cusco rarely spoke openly about the southern stalemate, yet within the barracks veterans told the truth in quieter tones. There existed a frontier that discipline alone could not dissolve. Tawantinsuyu could organize labor on a continental scale, relocate entire populations as minimes, and mobilize tens of thousands in precise formation, but it could not uproot a society built on local autonomy and collective defense. The Mapuche did not depend on a single capital or sacred throne. There was no head to cut off. The empire that had thrived on centralization encountered an opponent whose strength was dispersion. When Spanish power replaced Inca authority in the Andes, it inherited not only territory, but unfinished ambitions. After the fall of Atahualpa and the consolidation of Peru under colonial rule, conquistadors looked south with the same mixture of greed and confidence that had fueled earlier campaigns. The valley of the Mapuche seemed fertile, gold glimmered in river beds. The foundation of Santiago signaled permanence. Yet permanence required submission, and submission required breaking a people who had never accepted it. Pedro de Valdivia understood warfare in Europe and had witnessed the collapse of the Inca state. He believed the combination of steel, horses, and firearms rendered resistance futile. Early expeditions south established cities such as Concepcion and La Imperial. Spanish authority appeared to advance steadily toward the Biobío. But beneath the surface, Mapuche communities were studying the newcomers just as they had once observed the Inca formations. At the Maule, they learned that horses panicked when wounded, that arquebuses required time to reload, that armored riders became cumbersome when dragged to the ground. Knowledge became their equalizer. In 1553, the uprising led by Lautaro shattered Spanish complacency. Having served unwillingly among the invaders, Lautaro understood both their arrogance and their vulnerabilities. At Tucapel, he orchestrated a layered defense in wooded terrain, drawing cavalry into constricted space before enveloping them. Valdivia's death was not merely symbolic. It demonstrated that European military superiority could be neutralized through adaptation and terrain mastery. Spanish chronicles, often written to glorify conquest, could not conceal the shock. After Lautaro's fall in 1557, resistance did not fade. Leadership rotated among figures like Capulcan, whose legendary entrance test became part of oral memory, and warriors such as Galvarino, mutilated yet unbroken. Spanish reprisals were severe executions, forced labor, public punishments meant to instill terror. But terror failed to extinguish defiance. Instead, it deepened collective identity. The war hardened into a frontier conflict that drained resources and morale on both sides. By the end of the 16th century, Spain formalized what reality had already imposed. The Biobío River became a de facto boundary. Forts dotted its northern bank. Garrisons rotated through an endless cycle of vigilance and skirmish. Trade occurred in moments of truce. Raids erupted when trust dissolved. Over time, a system of parlamentos emerged, diplomatic assemblies where Spanish officials and Mapuche leaders negotiated as counterparts rather than conqueror and subject. It was an uneasy coexistence, yet historically remarkable. Few indigenous societies in the Americas compelled a European empire into sustained negotiation on equal footing. Centuries passed, and the frontier endured. Mapuche horsemen became formidable, cavalry in their own right, mastering the animals introduced by their adversaries. They incorporated iron tools through trade, reshaped tactics, and maintained mobility across forests and plains. Spanish Chile remained constrained north of the Biobío, its southern aspiration repeatedly frustrated. Generations of governors arrived promising decisive victory, most left having learned that geography and social cohesion favored the defenders. The 19th century brought new flags, but familiar ambitions. When Chile declared independence in 1810, leaders such as Bernardo O'Higgins envisioned a sovereign republic, stretching from desert to southern forests. Yet the republic inherited the same unresolved boundary for decades, internal consolidation, and regional wars delayed confrontation. Eventually, economic pressures and expansionist ideology converged. The campaign known as the Pacification of Araucania began in the 1860s, invoking order while pursuing incorporation. Unlike earlier empires, the Chilean state wielded industrial-era advantages, repeating rifles, artillery, rail logistics, telegraph communication. Mapuche resistance under leaders including Quilipan relied again on mobility and guerrilla tactics, avoiding direct engagement where firepower dominated. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, communities displaced. The conflict dragged on for 2 decades. By the early 1880s, the Chilean army declared success. Territory was divided, settlers installed, Mapuche populations confined to reduced lands. From one perspective, it marked the end of a 400-year struggle against successive states. From another, it revealed a deeper continuity. Empires had changed: Inca, Spanish, Chilean, but the dynamic remained constant. Centralized power pressing southward, decentralized communities resisting absorption. What differed in the 19th century was scale and technology. Where earlier campaigns had stalled at rivers, industrial warfare breached natural barriers. Yet even after military defeat, cultural survival persisted. Language endured. Ceremonies continued. Memory preserved the Maule, Tucapel. The Biobío not merely as battle sites, but as symbols of autonomy defended at immense cost. The Mapuche story complicates any simple narrative of inevitable conquest. It shows that expansion, however sophisticated, can be resisted for generations. It shows that adaptation can offset disparity. And it reminds us that the measure of power is not only how far it spreads, but how firmly it holds. The Inca once believed their road network bound the Andes into permanent unity. Spain believed its global empire unassailable. The Chilean Republic believed modernization justified incorporation. Each, in turn, confronted the same enduring truth. Authority imposed without consent meets resistance proportionate to identity. At land, the rivers of southern Chile became more than geography. They were lines drawn by people determined to define their own limits. History often compresses events into neat conclusions, but the reality along the southern rivers of Chile refused to be tidy. Even after the Chilean state declared victory in the 1880s, the legacy of resistance did not vanish into silence. The land had changed hands on official maps, yet memory remained unconquered. For centuries before the arrival of European sails on the horizon, the Mapuche had defined freedom not as abstract ideology, but as daily practice control over territory, kinship, and decision-making without distant rulers. That cultural foundation had enabled them to halt the expansion of Tawantinsuyu, challenge the authority of Spain, and endure the pressure of a modern republic. Looking back to the 15th century, the contrast is striking. The Inca state under Pachacuti and later Tupac Inca Yupanqui perfected centralized administration, census records, labor drafts, and storehouse systems allowed armies to campaign far from their core. Their engineering feats, roads stretching across mountains, suspension bridges over chasms were expressions of coordinated authority. But that same structure depended on hierarchy. When the Spanish captured Atahualpa at Cajamarca, the apex collapsed and the structure unraveled with stunning speed. Centralization had built strength, yet it also created vulnerability. The Mapuche model differed fundamentally. Authority was situational, leaders chosen for specific needs. In war, a Toki commanded. In peace, power dispersed again among local longos. No imperial bureaucracy tied them together, but neither could an invader dismantle them by capturing a single figure. This flexibility proved decisive at the Maule and later at Tucapel. It also sustained endurance across generations of frontier conflict. The Spanish crown, despite global wealth, could not transform southern Chile into another obedient colony. Instead, it learned to negotiate, to hold councils known as parlamentos, and to coexist uneasily across the Biobío River boundary. When the Republic of Chile inherited that frontier, it reframed expansion as national destiny rather than imperial ambition. Railways and telegraphs symbolized progress, settlement policies promised economic growth. Yet the underlying assumption mirrored earlier campaigns. That sovereignty must extend uninterrupted from north to south. Leaders invoked civilization and order. Mapuche communities saw dispossession. The War of the 1860s and 1870s was therefore not an isolated clash, but the culmination of centuries of contested authority. Even so, cultural persistence complicated the narrative of final defeat. After military campaigns ended, Mapuche communities adapted once more. They navigated new legal systems, defended land claims in courts, maintained language and ritual in the face of assimilation policies. In the 20th and 21st centuries, movements for recognition and restitution re-emerged, reframing the long history of resistance within modern political discourse. The memory of leaders like Lautaro and Capulcan continued to inspire identity, not as relics of a vanished past, but as symbols of resilience. The broader lesson transcends regional history. The clash between empire and autonomy along the Maule and Biobío reveals that military superiority does not guarantee permanence. The Inca possessed logistical genius. Spain wielded steel and gunpowder. The Chilean Republic commanded industrial weaponry. Each confronted a society whose cohesion rested less on infrastructure and more on shared commitment to land and collective decision-making. Time and again, expansion stalled where that commitment proved stronger than fear. This does not romanticize suffering. The wars brought devastation, villages burned, lives lost, territories fragmented. It does, however, challenge the myth of effortless conquest. Southern Chile was never simply absorbed. It was contested ground for centuries, its rivers marking negotiations between power and resistance. The Maule became the southern limit of Tawantinsuyu not by decree, but by battlefield reality. The Biobío became Spain's frontier not by design, but by necessity. The later incorporation into Chilean territory occurred only after prolonged conflict and transformation of warfare itself. Imagine standing on the banks of the Maule in the late 15th century, as disciplined Inca ranks approached the crossing, banners bright against the Andean sky. Imagine the shock as warriors surged from wooded hills, breaking formations thought unbreakable. Then shift forward to a Christmas afternoon in 1553, when armored horsemen ride into a forest clearing and discover that steel cannot secure obedience. Move again to the 19th century, where rifles crack across open plains and telegraph wires hung with orders, and yet resistance persists in ravines and forests. The scenery changes, the pattern endures. Empires often narrate their expansion as destiny. They measure success in territory gained, resources extracted, cities founded. The Mapuche measured success differently, in autonomy preserved, in language spoken, in land defended long enough for children to inherit memory. That difference explains why a decentralized society could outlast two empires and challenge a third. It explains why negotiations replaced annihilation more than once. And it explains why the history of southern Chile resists simple categorization as conquest. Today, the rivers still flow south from the Andes, indifferent to banners and borders. Yet beneath their current lies the sediment of centuries of struggle. The story of the Inca halted at the Maule, of Spanish cavalry broken at Tucapel, of fort lines drawn along the Biobío, is ultimately a story about limits of force, limits of ambition, limits of centralized authority when confronted by collective resolve. It reminds us that power is never absolute and that even the most formidable states encounter communities willing to defend autonomy at any cost. The Mapuche did not possess an empire of gold or stone. They possessed continuity against imperial road networks and colonial cities. They set mobility and cohesion against firearms and artillery. They set adaptation and terrain. The result was not uninterrupted victory, nor was it simple defeat. It was a 400-year negotiation written in blood and memory across valleys and forests. And in that long negotiation lies one of the most extraordinary chapters of resistance in the history of the Americas. If you confirm, next I will generate the 50 image prompts in your exact 14th century medieval cinematic style.